I was pouring a completely average bottle of red wine into my uncle's glass when my father stood up, tapped his spoon against crystal, and proudly announced to our entire extended family that my $420,000 condo was now my sister's Christmas present. He smiled at me across the table, told a room full of 20 relatives that I was generously downsizing to help family, and watched them all erupt into applause. I did not drop the wine bottle. I did not scream. I just raised my own glass and smiled back because the deed folded inside my coat pocket in the hallway was about to turn their perfect holiday victory into a complete financial nightmare. Welcome back to the channel where quiet women face loud families and let the paper trail do the shouting. If a story has ever made you set a boundary you had been putting off for years, you are in the right place. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. The dining room was suffocatingly warm, filled with the smell of roasted turkey pine needles and the expensive cologne my brother-in-law Tyler bought on credit. I had been up since 6 in the morning, helping my mother Susan prepare a Christmas dinner for 24 people. I am 32 years old, and for the last 10 years, I have been the invisible scaffolding holding my family together. I do not ask for applause, and I certainly never receive it. My sister Brittany is 29. She's expecting her first child. She is married to Tyler, a 31-year-old man who uses words like disruptive market synergy, but cannot seem to pay his car insurance on time. I am a commercial loan underwriter. I spend 50 to 60 hours a week analyzing risk-vetting corporate financial statements and exposing fraudulent asset claims for a major lending firm. I know how money moves. I know how debt works. I know what a lie looks like on a balance sheet. So when my father Richard clinked his glass to quiet the room, my brain was already running a background check on his posture. Richard stood at the head of the table like a proud king holding court. He waited until every conversation stopped and every face turned toward him. He placed his hands on the back of his chair, cleared his throat, and looked directly at Tyler and Brittany. He said it had been a challenging year for everyone. He said Tyler's investment portfolio had hit a temporary liquidity snag, which was an incredibly generous way of saying Tyler had blown his savings on failed shell companies and cryptocurrency. He said that with the new baby coming, family had to step up. Family had to look out for blood. Then my father turned his gaze down the long table and fixed his eyes directly on me. He told the room that I had made an incredibly selfless decision. He announced that I had agreed to hand over my condo to Tyler and Brittany. He said I was giving them the keys so the baby could have a real home in a safe suburban neighborhood. He framed it as me generously downsizing, making a sacrifice so that my sister could thrive. He lifted his glass and proposed a toast to my unmatched generosity. The sheer audacity of it washed over me like ice water. I stood there with the wine bottle still in my hand, listening to my aunts and uncles clap. I looked at my mother, who was sitting to my right, dabbing at her eyes with a cloth napkin and performing a perfect display of maternal gratitude. I looked at Brittany, who was smiling at her plate with quiet, smug satisfaction. And I looked at Tyler, who had leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, wearing the confident smirk of a man who believed he had just been handed nearly $500,000 of real estate for free. They had planned this. They had orchestrated this entire moment down to the last detail. My parents knew that I despised public confrontations. I have spent my entire life avoiding scenes, swallowing my objections, and making sure the holidays remained peaceful. They were weaponizing my own personality against me. They believed that by announcing the theft of my home in front of 20 relatives, they would trap me in a social corner. They assumed I would be too embarrassed, too polite, and too beaten down to correct my father in front of his brothers and sisters. They thought the pressure of the audience would force me into compliance, but they forgot what I do for a living. I evaluate assets and I assess liability. As the applause washed over the table, my underwriter brain immediately stripped the emotion away and began cataloging the absolute absurdity of my father's verbal transaction. I own that condo. My name is the only name on the deed. I bought it 6 years ago, and I worked double shifts to pay off the mortgage entirely 3 years ago. There is no bank holding a lien. There are no CO signers. It is a completely unencumbered asset worth $420,000. My father does not possess the legal authority to assign it to anyone. You cannot transfer a warranty deed over mashed potatoes and cranberry sauce. It requires a notary, a title company, and my signature, none of which they were ever going to get. Furthermore, I knew Tyler's financial profile. Tyler has the credit score of a ghost. I have seen the collection notices that arrive at their apartment. If I handed that condo over to Tyler, he would immediately attempt to leverage it. He would use the equity in my paid-off home as collateral to secure predatory loans for his next failed business venture. Within a year, the bank would foreclose on the property, and the home I built with my own two hands would belong to a private equity firm. My father was not asking me for a favor. He was holding me hostage at a dinner party and demanding that I hand over my entire net worth to a man who treats money like Monopoly cash. The clapping died down. The table was silent, waiting for me to speak. I could feel the weight of 20 stares pressing into my shoulders. My Aunt Linda leaned across the table and told me I was such a wonderful sister. My cousin asked when I was planning to move out. The trap was fully sprung, and they were all waiting for me to bow my head and step into it. I set the wine bottle down on the table. The glass clinked softly against the wood. I picked up my own wine glass. I looked at my father, who was watching me with a hard, challenging glint in his eye. I looked at my mother, who was holding her breath. I looked at Tyler, whose smirk had widened into a full grin. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw my drink. I did not ruin the dinner by screaming that they were trying to steal my property. Screaming is exactly what they wanted. Screaming would make me the emotional, unstable spinster sister ruining Christmas for the pregnant golden child. It would validate their narrative. I refuse to give people like that the ammunition they need to call me crazy. Instead, I kept my hand perfectly steady. I raised my glass toward my father. I smiled the warmest, brightest smile I could summon, and I looked him dead in the eye. "What a Christmas," I said. I took a slow sip of my wine and set the glass down. The table erupted again. My mother let out a massive sigh of relief and reached over to squeeze my arm. My father beamed, puffed out his chest, and sat back down to carve the rest of the roast. The tension in the room vanished, replaced by the loud, cheerful noise of a family that believed they had just successfully bullied their workhorse into surrendering her life savings. They thought I had capitulated. They thought my silence was surrender. They did not realize that my false compliance was merely a calculated strategy to buy myself the one thing I needed to destroy them legally: time. The rest of the dinner proceeded like a bizarre victory lap for a race they had not actually run. I sat quietly eating my food, participating in small talk, and watching them celebrate their stolen prize. Brittany talked extensively about how she wanted to tear down the wall between the kitchen and the living room to create an open-concept play area for the baby. She complained about the paint color in my master bedroom and asked if I minded if she hired a crew to repaint it eggshell white before she moved her furniture in. I told her she could pick out whatever colors she wanted. It was the absolute truth. She could pick out all the colors she liked. She was just never going to paint my walls with them. As dessert was being served, Tyler walked over to my end of the table. He smelled strongly of scotch and unearned confidence. He leaned over my chair, resting his hand too heavily on my shoulder, and dropped his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Hey," he said. "Since the lease on our apartment is up at the end of the month, we want to get a head start on moving the heavy stuff. Can I grab your spare keys tonight? I figured I could bring the U-Haul over tomorrow around noon and start clearing out the guest room." He did not ask if tomorrow was convenient. He did not ask if I needed time to pack my own belongings. He simply demanded the keys to my home less than an hour after my father had supposedly gifted it to him. The sheer blinding entitlement of the request solidified every single plan I was currently forming in my head. He wanted to physically occupy the space. He knew that possession is 9/10 of the law, and he wanted his boxes inside my door before I had a chance to reconsider. I looked up at him. I maintained the same pleasant, unbothered expression I had worn all evening. "I am so sorry, Tyler," I said, keeping my tone light and apologetic. "I left my spare set at the condo. I took a cab here straight from work yesterday, and I only have my primary set on my keychain. I cannot hand those over until I get home." Tyler frowned. The rejection of immediate gratification annoyed him, but he bought the excuse. He patted my shoulder again, a patronizing double tap. "No worries," he said. "I will just bring the moving truck by tomorrow at noon. Make sure you have the guest room cleared out, so we have somewhere to stack the crib boxes." I told him I would see him tomorrow. When the pie was finished and the coffee was poured, I stood up and began clearing the plates. I stacked the fine china, carried it into the kitchen, and spent 20 minutes loading the dishwasher and scrubbing the roasting pans. I did the chores I have always done because maintaining the routine was the ultimate camouflage. My mother came into the kitchen, humming a Christmas carol, and wrapped her arms around me from behind. "You did the right thing, Clara," she whispered. "Family takes care of family. You will see. This is going to bring us all so much closer." I dried my hands on a dish towel. I turned around and kissed her cheek. I told her I was glad she was happy. At 9 o'clock, I announced that I was exhausted from the work week and needed to head home. My father walked me to the front door. He hugged me a tight, approving embrace that he reserved only for moments when I obeyed his directives. He told me to drive safe and reminded me that Tyler would be there by noon. I put on my coat. I felt the comforting heavy weight of my deed folder securely zipped into the interior pocket. I walked down the driveway, got into my car, and locked the doors. I did not turn the radio on. I drove away from my childhood home in complete silence. They thought the war was over. They thought they had secured a $420,000 asset with nothing more than a toast and a heavy dose of social pressure. They were going to sleep tonight, dreaming of renovated kitchens and easy equity. But as I turned onto the highway and accelerated toward the city, I was not thinking about their victory. I was thinking about the 24-hour emergency locksmith, whose number I had already pulled up on my phone. My silence at the dinner table had given them a false sense of security, triggering their immediate physical overreach. They expected to walk into an open door tomorrow at noon. Instead, they were going to walk into a fortified fortress. The clock was ticking, and it was time for the underwriter to start declining applications. The drive back to the city was completely silent. I kept the radio off and the heater turned down low because the chill in the air helped clear the stifling warmth of that dining room from my lungs. The highway stretching ahead of me was practically deserted on Christmas night. Streetlights cast long yellow shadows across the dark asphalt, and the rhythmic hum of my tires provided the only soundtrack to my thoughts. Driving away from my childhood home, I did not feel the familiar heavy knot of guilt that usually accompanied my family interactions. Instead, I felt a deep, hyper-focused clarity. My father believed he had successfully closed a deal at that dinner table. My mother believed her social engineering had triumphed over my boundaries. Tyler believed he had secured a massive shortcut to wealth without lifting a finger. They all operated on the assumption that my quiet smile was an absolute submission to their authority. But in the commercial lending world where I spend my days, silence during a negotiation rarely means agreement. It usually means the opposing party is quietly auditing your leverage. Tyler was the glaring weak link in their master plan. He lacked discipline and he lacked foresight. A patient man would wait for the official paperwork to clear before making a move. A strategic man would hire a real estate attorney to review the property transfer. But Tyler was neither patient nor strategic. He was a man drowning in his own bad financial decisions, frantically grasping at any available life raft. He wanted physical possession of my condo immediately because he understood on some instinctual level that grabbing the space made it feel real. I knew exactly how his mind worked. He would not wait for a polite, structured transition. He would try to force his way in before I had a chance to change my mind. I pulled into my assigned parking space beneath my building. The concrete pillars and dim overhead fluorescent lights felt incredibly grounding. This structure was my territory. I rode the elevator up to the third floor, listening to the gentle mechanical hum of the cables. When I stepped into the carpeted hallway and approached my front door, I stopped and stared at the standard brass deadbolt. It was a perfectly good lock, but it possessed a fatal flaw. 3 years ago, when I first bought this place, I gave a spare key to my mother. I explicitly told her it was for extreme emergencies only. A major water leak, a medical crisis, the kind of rare, catastrophic events you trust a parent to handle. if you happen to be traveling out of state. Standing in the quiet corridor, the reality of my vulnerability hit me. Susan had that key. Susan, who had just spent dinner crying tears of theatrical joy over stealing my home, possessed direct physical access to it. I realized with absolute certainty that she had already offered that piece of brass to Tyler. She probably told him he could swing by her house early the next morning to pick it up. They were going to bypass my agency entirely. They thought they could simply unlock my front door and start claiming my square footage while I was too paralyzed by family loyalty to stop them. I turned my primary key in the lock, walked inside, and shut the door behind me. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. The soft glow from the street lamps outside illuminated the living room windows. I looked at the dark hardwood floors I had paid to have installed. I looked at the custom bookshelves I had spent 2 months building on weekends. This space was the physical manifestation of my financial independence. It was not a spare storage room for a failed entrepreneur. It was my sanctuary. I took off my winter coat and draped it over a dining chair. Standard emotional boundaries had completely failed with these people. My parents did not respect words like no or stop. They only respected physical barriers that they could not manipulate. So I decided to build a barrier they could not ignore. I sat on my sofa and opened my laptop. It was 11:30 on Christmas night. Most normal businesses were firmly shut and locked away until the morning. But corporate security issues do not respect holidays, and neither do the specialized locksmiths who cater to commercial properties. I searched online for an emergency 24-hour commercial security service. I intentionally bypassed the residential handymen and looked for elite companies that service downtown office buildings and high-end retail centers. I found a company called Apex Security Solutions. They prominently advertised rapid response times for corporate lockouts and access control upgrades. I dialed the local number listed on their website. A dispatcher answered on the second ring, his voice gruff and wide awake. I explained exactly what I required. I told him I did not need a simple residential rekey. I wanted the entire locking mechanism completely removed and replaced with commercial-grade hardware. I wanted a heavy-duty mortise lock and a smart keypad deadbolt that could not be bypassed by a standard bump key or forced entry. I also requested the immediate installation of a high-definition doorbell camera with remote live feed capabilities. The dispatcher paused for a moment. He informed me that sending a senior technician out on Christmas night for a full hardware replacement would incur a massive emergency holiday surcharge. He quoted a price that would make most people instantly hang up the phone. I told him I would pay the surcharge in cash upon arrival, provided the technician could be standing at my door within the hour. The dispatcher quickly confirmed the appointment. I closed my laptop and set it on the coffee table. I did not feel a single ounce of anxiety about the money. Money is simply a tool you use to control your environment and secure your assets. Tonight, I was buying absolute, undeniable control over my property. The technician arrived at exactly 1 a.m. His name was Marcus. He carried 2 heavy metal toolboxes and wore a crisp, dark gray uniform. He looked tired but intensely professional. I let him in and showed him the front entryway. I want this door to be completely impenetrable to anyone without the programmed code, I told him. Marcus inspected the door frame and the existing brass deadbolt. He nodded once, setting his heavy tools down on the entryway rug. He did not ask any probing questions about why a woman living alone needed corporate-level security installed in the middle of a holiday night. He just immediately went to work. For the next hour, my quiet apartment was filled with the harsh mechanical sounds of drilling metal, grinding against metal, and the heavy ratcheting of thick screws being driven deep into the wooden doorframe. I sat at my kitchen island and drank a glass of cold water, watching him systematically dismantle my old vulnerability. He removed the shiny brass deadbolt that my mother's spare key could unlock. He tossed it into a plastic recycling bin. That simple metallic clank sounded exactly like a heavy chain being cut. By 2 a.m, the new security system was fully installed and operational. The exterior of my door now featured a sleek, matte black keypad and a reinforced steel strike plate surrounding the deadbolt housing. It looked incredibly imposing. It looked like the entrance to a vault. Marcus handed me the programming instructions and walked me through the digital setup. I created a complex alphanumeric access code that had zero connection to my birth date, my phone number, or any other personal detail my family might attempt to guess. Next, he mounted the discrete doorbell camera at eye level. It was a high-resolution unit with a wide-angle lens that captured the entire width of the hallway. He helped me sync the live video feed directly to a secure application on my phone. The picture quality was remarkably clear. I could see the exact spot where anyone attempting to enter would have to stand. I paid Marcus his premium emergency rate, added a substantial cash tip for his speed and professionalism, and thanked him for his time. He packed up his tools and left. The heavy door clicked shut behind him with a solid, satisfying thud. I stood in the entryway and tested the lock myself. I threw the deadbolt from the inside using the thumb turn. The heavy mechanism engaged with a deep, resonant clank that vibrated slightly through the solid wood. It was the distinct sound of absolute finality. My mother's emergency spare key was now a completely useless piece of carved brass. Tyler's anticipated shortcut to a free apartment was officially closed. I walked to my bedroom, changed into my pajamas, and got into bed. I placed my phone face up on the nightstand with the security camera application running silently in the background. I felt an overwhelming sense of deep, physiological calm. The frantic, suffocating energy of the family dinner party was entirely gone. I closed my eyes and slept better than I had in many months. I woke up naturally just after 7 in the morning. The winter sunlight was pale and thin, casting a cool, crisp glow across my bedroom floor. It was December 26th, the exact day my family truly believed they were expanding their territory into my life. I stretched my arms, got out of bed, and walked into the kitchen. I went through my normal morning routine with deliberate slowness. I ground fresh coffee beans, boiled water, and prepared a meticulous pour-over. I appreciated the quiet, undisturbed rhythm of the morning. I deeply appreciated that I was standing in a kitchen I legally owned, drinking coffee I bought with my own salary, preparing for a confrontation I completely controlled from the high ground. I carried my warm mug to the living room and sat in my favorite armchair by the window. I opened the security camera application on my phone. The hallway outside my front door was empty, well lit, and perfectly still. At exactly 8 in the morning, my phone vibrated in my hand. A text message notification appeared on the illuminated screen. The sender was Susan. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee before opening the message. I wanted to fully digest the flavor before letting her predictable words into my peaceful space. I unlocked the screen and read the text. Tyler is bringing the U-Haul at noon. Make sure your things are cleared out of the master bedroom so they can start painting the nursery. I stared at the glowing letters on the glass screen. The message was an absolute masterpiece of maternal entitlement and boundary destruction. There was no polite greeting. There was no gentle request. There was only a commanding, authoritative directive. She was openly ordering me to physically dismantle my own life so her preferred child could redecorate my sanctuary. She had already decided that the master bedroom, the private room where I slept every night, no longer belonged to me. She was actively coordinating a hostile takeover via text message before I had even finished my breakfast. My underwriter brain quickly analyzed the logistics of her timeline. Tyler was arriving at noon. He had already rented a commercial moving truck. This meant he was fully committed to the action. He was investing actual time and money into the arrogant assumption that I had completely surrendered my assets to him. My mother was managing the timeline, acting as the eager foreman for my own eviction. They were moving in perfect lockstep, powered entirely by the sheer momentum of their own shared delusion. If I called her right now and argued, she would panic and pivot her strategy. She would rally my father to her side. They would show up together at my building, bringing heavy emotional manipulation and loud guilt trips right to my doorstep. They would try to turn my resistance into a tearful, messy family debate in the public hallway. I did not want a debate. I wanted them to hit a solid brick wall at full speed. To accomplish that, I needed to let them keep accelerating their plans. I needed them to firmly believe the runway was completely clear, right up until the exact fraction of a second they crashed. I set my coffee mug down on the small wooden side table. I tapped the blank reply box on my phone screen. I did not type out a long paragraph explaining my feelings or my legal rights. I did not demand basic respect or ask for an apology they were incapable of giving. I did not use any words at all. Words were a currency my family fundamentally did not value or respect. I opened the emoji keyboard on my phone. I scrolled past the faces and the symbols until I found exactly what I was looking for. I selected the simple, bright yellow thumbs up icon. I hit send. The message delivered instantly. A bright blue text bubble containing a single thumbs up now rested just beneath my mother's outrageous eviction command. It was the perfect, flawless bait. It signified total agreement to their eyes. It signaled weak compliance. It told them absolutely everything they desperately wanted to hear, while legally committing me to absolutely nothing. I locked my phone screen and set the device down next to my coffee mug. The trap was now fully set, primed, and waiting for the target. I leaned back into the comfortable fabric of my armchair, looked directly toward my heavily fortified front door, and prepared to enjoy the rest of my quiet morning. At exactly 11:54 in the morning, the heavy rumble of a commercial diesel engine echoed through the quiet suburban street, 3 stories below my living room window. I did not get up from my armchair. I simply glanced down at my phone resting on the coffee table. The high-definition feed from my new doorbell camera glowed on the screen, showing the empty, carpeted hallway. A few seconds later, the camera's motion sensor triggered. The recording light blinked green. Tyler swaggered into the frame first. He was wearing a designer puffer jacket and holding an oversized iced coffee, looking less like a man ready to move heavy furniture and more like a regional manager arriving to inspect a warehouse. Brittany waddled in behind him, visibly pregnant, holding a clipboard and pointing at the walls of the hallway, as if she were already planning where to hang her decorative sconces. Behind them trailed 2 men I faintly recognized. Tyler's fraternity brothers from college, both wearing matching athletic gear and carrying flattened cardboard boxes. They had actually done it. They had rented the truck, enlisted free labor, and driven across the city on the day after Christmas, entirely fueled by the arrogant certainty that my life was theirs for the taking. I watched the screen as Tyler stepped up to my door. He did not bother to knock. He did not ring the doorbell. He simply set his coffee down on the floor, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out a shiny brass key attached to a familiar red lanyard. My mother's emergency key. She really had handed it over to him, probably with a warm hug and a cheerful comment about family fairness. Tyler slid the brass key toward the lock, except there was no brass keyhole waiting for him. I watched his hand stop midair. The camera captured the exact moment his brain failed to process the sleek, matte black digital keypad that had completely replaced the standard deadbolt he was expecting. He blinked, pulled the key back, looked at the door number to confirm he was on the right floor, and then stared at the keypad again. "What is wrong?" Brittany's voice filtered clearly through the camera's external microphone. She sounded annoyed already, tapping her pen against her clipboard. "The lock is different," Tyler muttered, his brow furrowing. He aggressively pushed the brass key against the glass surface of the keypad, as if applying physical force would somehow materialize a mechanical keyhole. She must have changed the setup. Or the building did. "Well, punch in the code, Tyler," Brittany huffed, crossing her arms over her maternity sweater. "Mom said she would leave it unlocked or give you the code. Mom just gave me this key." He snapped back, his frustration mounting. He slapped his palm against the heavy steel strike plate. "Hey, Clara, open up." He pounded his fist against the solid wood door. The heavy thuds vibrated through the frame, but I remained perfectly still on my sofa. I took a slow sip of my water. I was not going to open the door. I was not going to engage in a screaming match through the peephole. I was going to let his own entitlement dig the hole he was about to fall into. "She is probably out running errands," Brittany sighed, rolling her eyes at the two frat brothers who were now awkwardly shifting their weight in the hallway. Just force it. Or drill it. You brought the tool bag, did you not? Dad said we need to get the nursery painted by tomorrow. I sat forward. She had actually suggested drilling through a commercial-grade lock on an apartment they did not own. The sheer blinding audacity of it was staggering, yet entirely on brand for my family. Tyler reached into the canvas bag slung over his shoulder and pulled out a cordless power drill. He was angry now. The performative swagger had evaporated, replaced by the red-faced indignation of a man who had been promised a free prize and was furious to find it wrapped in plastic. He actually believed that because Richard had declared the condo his at a dinner table, he possessed the legal right to destroy the front door to claim it. He pressed the drill bit against the hardened steel of the smart lock. The high-pitched whine of the motor screeched through the camera's audio feed. That was my cue. I did not call my father. I did not text my mother. I picked up my phone, minimized the camera application, and dialed 911. City Dispatch. What is your emergency? The operator answered, calm and efficient. Yes, I need police assistance immediately, I said, keeping my voice steady, modulating it to the exact pitch of a frightened but rational homeowner. There are 4 people outside my front door. One of them is actively using a power drill to break through my digital deadbolt. I am inside the unit alone, and I am fearing for my safety. Understood, ma'am. Are they actively drilling right now? Yes, I can see them on my security camera. I gave her my address, my unit number, and a physical description of Tyler. We have a patrol unit 2 blocks away. Stay inside, lock any interior doors, and do not engage with them. Officers are en route. I disconnected the call. I walked into my home office, opened the top drawer of my filing cabinet, and pulled out the crisp, notarized copy of my property deed that I had printed a week ago. I grabbed my state-issued driver's license, slipped both documents into a slim leather folio, and walked back to the living room. Through the door, the drilling had stopped, replaced by Tyler cursing loudly and kicking the base of the frame. Commercial-grade steel does not yield to a standard hardware store drill bit, and Tyler was learning a very loud, very public lesson about the limits of his own competence. Less than 4 minutes later, the heavy sound of bootsteps echoed through the camera feed. 2 uniformed police officers rounded the corner of the hallway, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Step back from the door. Drop the drill. Now the lead officer commanded, his voice echoing sharply down the corridor. Tyler jumped, nearly dropping the power tool on his own foot. He spun around, his face draining of color as he registered the police presence. The 2 frat brothers immediately backed away, raising their hands in a universal gesture of non-involvement. Brittany let out a sharp gasp, dropping her clipboard. Whoa, hey officer, relax, Tyler stammered, putting his hands up and forcing a nervous, patronizing chuckle. This is just a misunderstanding. We are family. We are moving in today. Put the drill on the ground and step away from the door, the second officer repeated, unamused. We received a call regarding an active break-in. It is not a break-in, Brittany, interjected, stepping forward with her hands on her hips, her voice dripping with suburban indignation. This is my sister's condo. My father gave it to us for Christmas. We are just trying to get inside because the lock is jammed. The lead officer raised an eyebrow. Your father gave you your sister's condo? Yes. Tyler jumped in, regaining a fraction of his fake confidence. It is a family arrangement. She is moving out. I was just trying to bypass the broken deadbolt so we could start moving the crib in. I unlocked my deadbolt from my phone, opened the front door, and stepped out into the hallway. I did not look at Tyler. I did not look at Brittany. I looked directly at the lead officer. Officers, thank you for arriving so quickly, I said, my voice completely calm, polite, and authoritative. I am the sole owner of this property. I did not invite these people here. I did not authorize them to enter, and I certainly did not give them permission to destroy my front door with a power tool. Tyler's jaw dropped. Clara, what the hell are you doing? Tell them Dad gave us the place. Sir, be quiet, the officer snapped at Tyler before turning back to me. Ma'am, they are claiming this is a family property transfer. I opened my leather folio. I pulled out my driver's license and the notarized copy of the warranty deed. I handed both to the officer. Here is my government-issued ID, and here's the recorded deed for this unit. You will see that my name, Clara Hayes, is the only name listed as the grantee. There is no mortgage company, no co-signer, and certainly no mention of a Tyler or Brittany. The officer reviewed the documents, carefully checking the name against my license and the unit number against the doorframe. He handed them back to me with a respectful nod. The situational dynamic shifted instantly. I was no longer a potential domestic dispute. I was a verified property owner dealing with vandals. The officer turned to Tyler, his expression hardening into concrete. Sir, you do not own this property. You have zero legal right to be here, and you were caught on camera attempting to drill through a secured commercial lock. That is attempted breaking and entering and willful destruction of private property. Wait, no, you do not understand. Tyler stammered, his face turning a blotchy, panicked red. He looked at me, his eyes wide with desperate fury. Clara, tell them Dad said it was ours. Tell them it is a misunderstanding. I have nothing to say to you. Tyler, I replied smoothly, looking at him with the detached pity one reserves for a misbehaving child in a grocery store. Brittany began to cry. Not the fake manipulative tears she used to get her way at dinner, but genuine, humiliated, terrified tears. Neighbors were beginning to peek out of their doors down the hallway, drawn by the commotion. Two of them were holding their phones. Tyler and Brittany were being publicly dismantled in real time. The second officer unclipped his radio. We can take him in for attempted break-in and vandalism, ma'am. Do you want to press charges? Tyler froze. The two frat brothers had already pressed the elevator button and were aggressively staring at the floor, abandoning the ship before it fully sank. I looked at my sister sobbing in the hallway, clutching her pregnant stomach, and Tyler looking completely emasculated and terrified of handcuffs. I did not want the messy, drawn-out process of criminal court. I wanted a clean, devastating surgical strike that sent a message back to my parents. I will not press charges today, officer, I said calmly, provided they leave the premises immediately, pay for the minor cosmetic damage to the strike plate, and never return to this building. The lead officer nodded. He turned to Tyler and pointed down the hall. You heard the lady. Pick up your drill. Take your friends. Get in the elevator. If we see you within 500 feet of this building again, you are going out in cuffs. Move. Tyler did not say another word. He scooped up his drill bag, grabbed his iced coffee, and practically sprinted toward the elevator, leaving his pregnant wife to waddle furiously behind him. I thanked the officers, stepped back inside, and let the heavy commercial deadbolt lock securely behind me. The moving truck drove away empty 10 minutes later. The physical threat was neutralized, but I knew my phone was about to explode. The real war was just beginning. The fallout from a thwarted theft does not arrive as a sudden explosion. It seeps into your life like carbon monoxide, invisible and highly toxic. After the police cruisers rolled away and the heavy commercial deadbolt clicked securely shut, my physical apartment remained a sanctuary of absolute silence. The digital realm, however, became an active war zone. My mother did not call me to hurl insults or demand frantic explanations. Susan is a seasoned architect of social perception. She understands that direct confrontation is risky because it leaves room for logical counterarguments. Instead, she mobilized the most lethal weapon she possessed, the affluent, tightly knit suburban church community where she had spent 3 decades cultivating a flawless reputation. I watched the smear campaign unfold in real time through a slow cascade of incoming text messages and passive-aggressive social media updates. Susan moved swiftly to control the narrative before the truth of the police encounter could surface. In her carefully curated version of the morning, Tyler and Brittany had simply arrived to help me take measurements for new nursery furniture as a generous family favor. According to my mother, I had suffered a catastrophic paranoid breakdown, locking them out and calling the authorities in a fit of hysterical jealousy over my sister's pregnancy. She painted a portrait of me that perfectly suited the demographic she was manipulating. I was suddenly the bitter, career-obsessed older sister, a cold spinster hoarding her wealth entirely devoid of maternal instinct or familial loyalty. Brittany naturally was cast as the terrified, fragile, expectant mother who had been subjected to the trauma of flashing police lights purely because she wanted to bond with her older sibling. The sheer velocity of the gossip was impressive. By Saturday evening, women I had not spoken to since high school were sending me unsolicited messages, dripping with condescending pity. An elder from the church committee left a lengthy voicemail suggesting I seek immediate psychiatric help and reminding me that the Lord commands us to forgive. A distant cousin texted a long paragraph about how wealth corrupts the soul and how my grandfather would be deeply ashamed of my cruelty toward a pregnant woman. I read every single message. I saved every voicemail. I did not respond to a single one. Engaging with a targeted character assassination only validates the premise of the attack. If you try to explain that you are defending your property against a power drill, the audience simply pivots to accusing you of valuing a wooden door over your pregnant sister's feelings. It is a rigged game played on a board they built, and the only winning move is to refuse to pick up the dice. I let my mother harvest her sympathy. I let her soak in the baked casseroles and the concerned phone calls from her country club acquaintances. Her frantic need to paint me as a villain signaled something deeply important to my analytical mind. It confirmed that she was desperate to justify whatever they had planned next. The smear campaign was not just emotional punishment. It was a preemptive strike to ensure that when they finally took my home, the community would view it as righteous justice rather than grand larceny. The silence from my father lasted exactly 4 days. Richard is not a man who operates on emotion. He operates entirely on leverage. While Susan managed the public relations crisis, Richard was undoubtedly working behind the scenes, assessing the damage and formulating a strategy to bypass my commercial lock. He realized that emotional guilt trips and social shaming were insufficient to move me. He needed a direct, forceful intervention. The summons arrived on a Tuesday afternoon via a stark, uncompromising text message. Meet me at the Roasted Bean on 4th Street tomorrow at 6. We need to finalize this situation. He did not choose his own living room, nor did he invite himself to my apartment. He chose a neutral, brightly lit coffee shop in a busy commercial district. That specific geographic choice communicated volumes. He wanted a public venue where I would be socially constrained from causing a scene, and he wanted neutral territory so I would not feel empowered by the boundaries of my own home. He was intentionally shifting the dynamic from a family dispute to a hard business negotiation. I accepted the invitation. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer, the exact same one I wear when advising corporate clients on defaulting credit lines. I wanted my physical presentation to remind him exactly who he was attempting to intimidate. The coffee shop was humming with the low, steady noise of espresso machines and evening commuters. I found my father sitting at a small corner table near the back window. He had not purchased a drink. He was simply sitting with his hands resting flat on the wooden table, staring straight ahead. When I took the seat across from him, the polite paternal facade I had known for 32 years was completely gone. The man sitting opposite me was not the father who taught me how to ride a bicycle. He was a desperate man staring at an obstacle blocking his survival. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask about the police incident. He reached into the breast pocket of his heavy coat and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He slid it across the small, round table until it touched the edge of my purse. "I have tried to do this the easy way, Clara," he said. His voice was low, gravelly, and entirely stripped of any familial warmth. "We tried to let you be generous. We tried to let you do the right thing on your own terms, but you decided to act like a child and embarrass your sister in front of half the city." I looked at the envelope. "What is this, Richard?" I intentionally dropped the title of Dad. The shift in nomenclature registered in his eyes with a brief flicker of irritation, but he pressed forward. "It is a comprehensive accounting of your debts," he stated coldly. I opened the flap and pulled out a 3-page document. It was formatted like a formal invoice, complete with a terrifyingly meticulous spreadsheet. I scanned the itemized lines. My college tuition from a state university 10 years ago. The down payment on a used Honda Civic I drove when I was 19. Orthodontic braces from when I was 12 years old. Health insurance premiums paid on my behalf during my teenage years. Food and boarding costs calculated from my 18th birthday until the day I moved out of his house. At the bottom of the third page, a bold, underlined total glared up at me. $120,000. I stared at the number, feeling a surreal sense of clinical detachment. He had actually sat down, likely with a calculator and old bank statements, and retroactively itemized my childhood. He had converted 20 years of basic parental obligation into a retroactive bill of services. You owe this family a massive financial debt. My father continued, leaning forward, his voice dropping into a menacing whisper. You have hoarded your wealth while your sister struggles. You think you are entirely self-made, but you were built on our sacrifices. I am calling in the debt. He reached into the envelope again and pulled out a second document. It was a standard, pre-printed, quitclaim deed completely filled out, requiring nothing but my signature and a notary stamp to legally transfer the title of my condo directly to Tyler. Here's the offer, he said, tapping his index finger against the signature line. You sign this deed today. You transfer the property to Tyler and Brittany. In exchange, I will formally forgive this $120,000 debt. If you refuse, I will retain a lawyer, and I will sue you in civil court for unpaid family loans. I will drag your name through costly litigation, and I will make sure your firm knows exactly what kind of selfish person they employ. You will spend more money defending yourself than the condo is even worth. He sat back, crossing his arms, waiting for the threat to paralyze me. He expected me to crumble under the sheer weight of the financial intimidation and the prospect of a drawn-out public legal battle. I looked at the fake invoice. I looked at the quitclaim deed. And then I looked deeply into my father's face. He was sweating slightly along his hairline despite the cool air conditioning of the coffee shop. His knuckles were white. His breathing was shallow and rapid. In my profession, you learn to ignore what a person is saying and focus entirely on the mechanics of their demand. A man who simply needs $120,000 does not jump straight to demanding a piece of real estate worth $420,000. Real estate is highly illiquid. It requires maintenance taxes and months of time to sell. If my family was genuinely struggling to the point of suing their own daughter for teenage braces and groceries, they would demand liquid cash. I have a lucrative career and substantial savings. If this were truly about an unpaid debt, Richard would be threatening to garnish my wages or seize my investment accounts. But he was not asking for cash. He was aggressively, desperately maneuvering to secure the title to one specific physical asset. An unencumbered, fully paid-off condo. Why did he need that exact asset so badly? Why was Tyler's name on the grantee line instead of my parents'? Why the rushed holiday announcement, the frantic attempt to drill the lock, and now a fabricated invoice designed to blackmail me into signing away my equity? The desperation radiating from my father did not look like simple greed. It looked like a man standing on a sinking ship trying to steal a life raft. Tyler did not just want a free place to live. Richard did not just want to help his pregnant daughter. They needed the physical collateral. They needed a clean title to a high-value asset, and they needed it immediately. My underwriter instincts flared sharp and undeniable. There was a massive, catastrophic financial liability hidden somewhere in my family's portfolio, and they were attempting to plug the hole with my property. I carefully aligned the edges of the fake invoice. I folded the 3 pages neatly in half and tucked them securely into my purse. I left the quitclaim deed sitting alone on the table. I will be keeping the invoice for my personal records, I said, keeping my tone as light and conversational as if we were discussing the weather. It will be an excellent piece of evidence if you actually decide to file a frivolous lawsuit. Richard's confident posture fractured. He leaned forward, his voice rising above a whisper, drawing a quick glance from a barista wiping down the counter. Do not test me, Clara. You have 24 hours to sign that paper. I stood up from the table. I looked down at the man who had just tried to extort his own daughter for the cost of her childhood. I did not feel angry. I felt like a surgeon who had just diagnosed a terminal illness. You should have asked for cash, Richard, I said quietly. It would have been much more convincing. I turned and walked out of the coffee shop. I did not look back. I stepped out into the cool evening air, my mind already shifting away from the emotional betrayal and diving straight into the analytical mechanics of the problem. They were hiding something massive. They were suffocating under a debt they could not control, and they were willing to destroy me to survive it. If they wanted to treat our relationship like a corporate transaction, I was more than happy to oblige. I walked to my car, pulled out my phone, and prepared to do what I do best. I was going to conduct a comprehensive forensic audit of my own family, and I was going to find out exactly what kind of ghost they were running from. The fluorescent lights of the 42nd floor always hummed at a specific frequency that most people learn to tune out. I never tuned it out. To me, that low, steady mechanical drone was the sound of objective reality. I walked into my office at exactly 7:30 on Monday morning, set my leather bag on the credenza, and woke up my dual monitors. The weekend was officially over. The emotional theater my family had tried to drag me into was closed. I was no longer the ungrateful daughter sitting in a coffee shop, absorbing my father's hollow threats. I was Clara Hayes, senior commercial underwriter, and I was about to do to my brother-in-law exactly what I do to multi-million-dollar corporations that lie on their loan applications. In my line of work, we have a saying, the pitch is poetry, but the ledger is prose. People can tell you any story they want. They can dress up in expensive suits, lease luxury vehicles, and toss around buzzwords like market disruption and scalable synergy. But money leaves a permanent, unalterable fingerprint. Every transaction, every debt, every legal maneuver is cataloged somewhere in a database. You just need to know which digital stone to overturn. I opened my browser and logged directly into the State Business Registry, bypassing the standard public search portal and utilizing the advanced investigative tools my firm paid a premium to access. I typed in Tyler's full legal name. I did not expect to find a thriving enterprise, but even I was genuinely staggered by the sheer volume of financial wreckage that populated on my screen. Tyler was not an entrepreneur. He was a serial creator of shell companies. I scrolled through a sprawling, disorganized graveyard of limited liability corporations. There were tech consulting firms, logistics startups, and boutique marketing agencies. Most of them had been registered, maintained for less than 8 months, and then quietly dissolved when the State Franchise Tax Board automatically suspended them for failure to file basic annual returns. He was creating empty paper vessels, likely using them to secure small lines of corporate credit, draining those lines to fund his lifestyle, and abandoning the entities when the creditors began calling. It was a classic low-level bust-out strategy, the kind of amateur financial maneuvering that only works until you inevitably run into a lender who possesses the resources to actually chase you down. I began cross-referencing the dissolved business names with the county civil court dockets. That is when the true shape of the disaster began to materialize. Tyler was not just broke. Being broke is a static condition. Tyler was actively, aggressively imploding. I found the active litigation filed in the Superior Court just 3 months prior. The plaintiff was a ruthless, highly capitalized private equity group that specialized in commercial real estate acquisitions. They were suing Tyler and his most recent holding company for breach of contract, severe property damage, and total default on a commercial lease agreement. The total damages sought amounted to a staggering $300,000. I pulled the publicly available complaint documents and read through the legal filings. Tyler had apparently attempted to launch a high-end co-working space. He had leased a massive downtown warehouse, hired contractors to tear down the interior walls, and then completely ran out of funding before a single permit was approved or a single desk was installed. The private equity firm was not merely suing him to recoup the lost rent. They were coming after him for the immense cost of restoring the gutted building to a usable condition. The attorneys representing the plaintiff were entirely unforgiving. They had already pierced the corporate veil, arguing successfully that Tyler had commingled his personal funds with the business accounts, thereby rendering his limited liability protection null and void. They were not just taking his company to the cleaners, they were holding him personally liable for every single penny of that $300,000 judgment. I leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair and took a slow sip of my coffee. The puzzle pieces were rapidly snapping together, forming a horrifyingly clear picture. This was why Tyler was so desperate to physically occupy my condo. This was why my father was willing to fabricate a fake invoice and threaten to sue his own daughter. They needed an unencumbered high-value asset to liquidate or leverage immediately to keep Tyler out of civil court and potentially out of a criminal fraud investigation. But a question still lingered in my mind. Why was Richard behaving with such frantic, uncharacteristic desperation? My father was a proud man, but he was also deeply risk-averse. He would typically distance himself from a spectacular failure like Tyler, rather than diving headfirst into the wreckage to save him. Richard threatening to extort me for childhood braces did not align with a man merely trying to help his son-in-law out of a tight spot. It reeked of a man who was fighting for his own basic survival. I opened a new tab on my monitor and navigated to the county property records database. I typed in the address of the 4-bedroom suburban house where I grew up. The house where my parents still lived, the house they proudly treated as the crown jewel of their entire existence. I pulled up the chain of title and the historical lien records. For a moment, I just stared at the screen, letting the reality of the digital ink wash over me. My stomach felt completely hollow, dropping away into a cold, bottomless void. 4 years ago, my parents had successfully paid off their original 30-year mortgage. They had hosted a celebratory dinner party to commemorate owning their home free and clear. I'd brought a bottle of expensive champagne to congratulate them. According to the county recorder's office, that state of financial freedom had lasted exactly 1 year. 18 months ago, precisely when Tyler was signing his doomed commercial lease with the private equity firm, a massive new lien had been recorded against my parents' property. It was a home equity line of credit, commonly known as a HELOC, issued by a secondary high-interest regional bank. The principal amount of the credit line was $250,000. My parents had not taken out $250,000 to remodel their kitchen or travel the world. I pulled the subordination agreements and the collateral pledges associated with the filing. They had deliberately leveraged the entire equity of their fully owned home to act as the primary financial guarantors for Tyler's commercial warehouse lease. They had co-signed his delusion. They had bet the very roof over their heads on a man who could not even successfully maintain a basic business registration. But the horror did not stop at the existence of the loan. I dug deeper into the public notice database, searching for active pre-foreclosure filings. The search engine spun for 2 seconds before delivering the final devastating blow. A notice of default had been formally recorded against my parents' property 45 days ago. The mechanics of a HELOC default are brutal and unforgiving. When you use your primary residence as collateral for a commercial business venture, you strip away most of the consumer protections designed to keep families in their homes. Tyler had obviously stopped making the massive monthly payments on the credit line the moment his co-working space venture collapsed. Because my parents were the legal guarantors, the bank simply turned their attention to the collateral. According to the default notice, the regional bank was initiating aggressive foreclosure proceedings. My parents were exactly 60 days away from having their home auctioned off on the courthouse steps. 60 days until the sheriff arrived to physically remove their belongings and lock them out of the house they had lived in for 3 decades. I sat in the sterile, air-conditioned environment of my corporate office, surrounded by glass walls and muted carpet, and I finally understood the sheer terrifying magnitude of the lie my family was currently living. Every single action they had taken over the past 2 weeks had been driven by a suffocating, blinding panic. The sudden Christmas dinner announcement was not a clumsy attempt at generosity. It was a calculated ambush born of absolute terror. They knew the bank was moving to seize their property. They knew Tyler was facing a crippling $300,000 judgment. They were drowning in a self-inflicted financial apocalypse, and they had collectively decided that my fully paid-off $420,000 condo was the only life raft large enough to hold them all. They did not want my condo so Brittany could paint a nursery and raise her baby in a good school district. They wanted my title so they could force me to sign a quitclaim deed. Once the property was legally in Tyler's name, or even my father's name, they planned to immediately march into a lender's office and take out a massive cash-out refinance loan against my equity. They intended to drain the financial lifeblood out of my sanctuary to satisfy the private equity firm and catch up on the defaulted home equity line of credit. They were going to sacrifice my future to cover their catastrophic mistakes, leaving me with a heavily mortgaged property I never asked to leverage. And they had planned to do it all while forcing me to smile and thank them for the privilege. I slowly exhaled, releasing a breath I did not realize I had been holding. The puzzle was completely solved. The motivations were entirely unmasked. My father was not threatening me because he felt entitled to compensation for my childhood meals. He was threatening me because he was 2 months away from being homeless, and his pride would not allow him to admit to his church community or his peers that he had bankrupted himself to fund his fraudulent son-in-law. The sheer cruelty of their strategy crystallized in my mind. If they had simply come to me, sat me down in a private room, and admitted the full truth, I might have actually helped them. I possess the financial resources and the professional expertise to negotiate debt settlements. I could have hired a restructuring attorney to deal with the private equity firm. I could have worked out a payment plan to stall the foreclosure on their home. I could have saved them. But they did not want to ask for my help because asking would require admitting failure. Asking would require acknowledging that the golden child's husband was a con artist and that the reliable, invisible daughter was the only competent adult in the family. Their fragile egos simply could not absorb that reality. Instead of asking for a rescue, they decided to orchestrate a robbery. They decided it was much easier to steal my home through social manipulation and legal extortion than to swallow their pride and ask me for a loan. I closed the property record database. I closed the civil court dockets. I meticulously logged out of the state business registry. I did not need to see any more numbers. I had every single piece of data required to understand exactly what kind of war I was fighting. My phone buzzed on the surface of my desk. The screen illuminated, displaying a new text message from my mother. It was perfectly timed, arriving just as the reality of her impending homelessness settled into my awareness. I picked up the device and read the message. "We have booked the main hall at the country club for a grand New Year's Eve bash." She wrote, her tone dripping with that familiar, sickeningly sweet, artificial warmth. "We will be celebrating Brittany and Tyler's beautiful new home with all our friends and family. I expect you to bring the signed paperwork to the party, Clara. Let us start the new year off right. Do not make your father ruin you legally. We love you." I stared at the glowing text. She was actively planning a lavish catered party at an expensive country club, smiling and drinking champagne with her social circle, while a bank was actively preparing to auction off her living room furniture. The delusion was so profound, it bordered on psychiatric. She truly believed that if they just maintained the performance of wealthy, successful suburbanites, they could bully me into handing over my deed before the illusion shattered. They were setting a trap. They were using the New Year's Eve party to recreate the dynamic of the Christmas dinner, but on a much grander scale. They wanted to surround me with 100 people, corner me with champagne toasts and social expectations, and force me to hand over the physical paperwork while everyone cheered for family unity. They needed the public spectacle to prevent me from fighting back. I set the phone down next to my keyboard. My hands were entirely steady. The cold, analytical underwriter inside my brain had completely taken the wheel. I was no longer a daughter navigating a complicated family dynamic. I was a secured asset manager dealing with a hostile, fraudulent acquisition attempt. My parents and my sister wanted to use a crowded room to force a transaction. They believed that an audience was their greatest weapon against my boundaries. They were absolutely certain that I would rather surrender my entire net worth than cause a scandal in front of their country club friends. They wanted an audience. I reached for my computer mouse and opened a new secure window. I began searching through my professional contacts for the direct phone number of a specialized corporate relocation firm I had worked with on a previous commercial deal. A firm that specialized in executing rapid, all-cash real estate acquisitions within 48 hours. My family wanted a public spectacle. They wanted to stand in front of 100 people and announce the transfer of my property. I decided in that quiet, humming office that I was going to give them exactly the audience they were so desperate to leverage. I was going to let them pour the champagne. I was going to let my father tap his glass and make his speech. And then I was going to hand them a completely different stack of paperwork. The anatomy of a financial crime is rarely a spontaneous event. It requires a quiet, methodical buildup, a staging of pieces, long before the actual theft occurs. I was still sitting at my desk, staring at the foreclosure notice on my parents' property, when the final missing variable of their timeline began to itch at the back of my mind. The Christmas dinner ambush had felt incredibly rushed. If they were simply trying to bully me into handing over a place for Brittany to live, they could have spent months laying the emotional groundwork. Instead, my father had tried to force a verbal contract in front of an audience, and Tyler had shown up with a moving truck 12 hours later. That kind of reckless speed does not come from a desire to decorate a nursery. It comes from an impending deadline. I navigated away from the county property database and returned to the state business registry. I'd already looked at Tyler's graveyard of dissolved shell companies, but I realized I had not sorted the search results by the most recent filing dates. I adjusted the filter parameters and hit refresh. A brand new entity populated at the very top of the list. It was a limited liability company called Apex Horizon Holdings. The name was perfectly meaningless, a generic corporate placeholder designed to sound impressive while revealing absolutely nothing about its actual operations. But it was not the name that made my pulse steady into a cold, rhythmic thud. It was the registration date. Apex Horizon Holdings had been formally incorporated exactly 8 days before Christmas. I pulled the incorporation documents. Tyler was listed as the sole managing member. The registered business address was a cheap virtual mailbox service downtown, but the stated business purpose section was what truly exposed the architecture of their scheme. The company was registered for the purpose of commercial real estate acquisition and asset leveraging. I sat back and let the entire grotesque blueprint assemble itself in my head. My family did not want my condo, so my sister could have a comfortable place to raise her child. They did not care about the morning light in my living room or the safe suburban neighborhood. They looked at my home and saw nothing but a $420,000 cash dispenser, and they had built a legal mechanism to empty it. If I had caved to the social pressure at the Christmas table, or if I had been frightened by my father's fake invoice at the coffee shop, the next step would have been swift and brutal. I would have signed that quitclaim deed legally transferring the title of my home to Tyler. The second my signature was notarized, Tyler would have transferred the deed directly into Apex Horizon Holdings. As a commercial underwriter, I know exactly what happens next. A man with a ruined personal credit score cannot walk into a traditional bank and get a standard mortgage, but a freshly minted corporate entity holding the free and clear title to a $500,000 asset does not need a traditional bank. Tyler would have taken that corporate deed straight to a hard money lender. Hard money lenders do not care about your credit history or your long-term business acumen. They care entirely about the hard equity in the collateral. They offer short-term, extremely high-interest loans based strictly on the immediate liquidation value of the property. Tyler would have easily secured a $300,000 cash-out loan against my condo within a matter of days. The moment the loan funded the money would have been dispersed to cover his catastrophic breach of contract lawsuit with the private equity firm. The remaining cash would have been frantically funneled to the regional bank to cure the default on my parents' home equity line of credit, stopping their impending foreclosure. They would have saved their 4-bedroom suburban house. Tyler would have stayed out of civil court, and I would have been left with absolutely nothing. Because a hard money loan comes with exorbitant interest rates and brutal repayment terms, Tyler had no income and no functioning business. He would have defaulted on the new loan almost immediately. Within 6 months, the hard money lender would have foreclosed on my condo. I would have been legally evicted from the home I bought with my own salary, and my family would have watched it happen from the safety of the living room I had just sacrificed my entire net worth to save. The sheer breathtaking malice of the plan sat heavy in my chest. This was not a family asking for a favor during a rough patch. This was a coordinated, premeditated financial slaughter. My parents were fully prepared to financially ruin their eldest daughter to subsidize the fraud committed by their son-in-law. They had calculated my value, decided I was completely expendable, and engineered a trap designed to skin me of every dollar I had ever earned. I thought about my mother hugging me in the kitchen on Christmas Eve, whispering that family takes care of family. I thought about my father raising his glass to my unmatched generosity. They had looked me in the eye, smiled warmly, and actively plotted my total financial destruction. The betrayal was so absolute, so flawlessly constructed, that it bypassed grief entirely and landed straight into a state of profound surgical detachment. You cannot mourn people who view you as livestock. You can only outmaneuver them. I closed the business registry window. I did not need any more proof. The evidence was irrefutable, securely downloaded and filed in an encrypted digital folder on my desktop. I had uncovered the entire apparatus of their deception. Now, the only remaining variable was how they intended to force the final execution of the document. My answer arrived exactly an hour later. My phone vibrated on the polished surface of my desk. A text message notification appeared on the screen. It was from Susan. I picked up the device. I did not feel the familiar spike of anxiety that usually accompanied her name. I felt the calm anticipation of a chess player watching their opponent make a highly predictable fatal mistake. I opened the message. "We have booked the main hall at the country club for a New Year's Eve bash," she wrote. The tone of the text was sickeningly triumphant, dripping with the arrogant certainty of a woman who believed she held all the cards. "We will be celebrating Brittany and Tyler's beautiful new home with all our friends and the entire congregation. I expect you to bring the signed deed to the party, Clara. Let us start the new year off right as a united family. Do not make us ruin you legally. We love you." I read the text twice. The audacity of the final sentence was almost poetic. "Do not make us ruin you legally. We love you." It was extortion wrapped in a maternal bow, but the location of the threat was what truly commanded my attention. The country club, a New Year's Eve bash with all their friends and the entire church congregation. Susan and Richard were doubling down on their primary tactic. They were escalating the psychological warfare. The Christmas dinner ambush had failed because the audience was too small and too familiar. I had managed to slip out before they could force a signature, so they were expanding the arena. They were inviting over 100 people to a formal catered event to celebrate a real estate acquisition that had not yet occurred. They intended to corner me in a massive ballroom filled with local elites, church elders, and community gossips. They were going to orchestrate a public presentation of the deed. They believed that standing in front of 100 expectant, smiling faces, I would be completely paralyzed by the fear of causing a social catastrophe. They were banking their entire financial survival on the assumption that I would rather sign away my home than publicly humiliate my parents on New Year's Eve. They wanted an audience. They believed an audience was their ultimate weapon against my boundaries. I set the phone down next to my keyboard. The low hum of the office ventilation system seemed to harmonize with the steady, measured beating of my heart. For 32 years, I had shrunk myself to fit into the quiet, compliant spaces my family designated for me. I had swallowed insults to keep the peace. I had paid bills to avoid arguments. I had allowed them to dictate the terms of our reality because I was terrified of being the source of conflict. But the woman who had accepted those terms no longer existed. She had died somewhere between the fake invoice at the coffee shop and the discovery of the predatory shell company. My parents wanted to use a crowded room to force a fraudulent transaction. They were absolutely certain that I would fold under the pressure of the spotlight. I looked at the glowing screen of my monitor. I looked at the text message demanding my submission. I decided right then that I was not going to run. I was not going to hide in my apartment and ignore their phone calls while they spun a narrative of my selfishness to the entire town. I was not going to let them control the story for one more minute. If they wanted a public spectacle, I would give them a public spectacle. If they wanted to stand in front of 100 people and announce the transfer of my property, I would ensure they had the absolute undivided attention of every single person in that room. They had booked the venue. They had invited the guests. They had set the stage for their own glorious salvation. I was going to walk onto that stage, take the microphone, and hand them a completely different kind of paperwork. An asset is only a liability if your adversaries know where to find it. As long as my name remained on the deed to that $420,000 condominium, my family would treat it as a communal bank account. They would never stop trying to break it open. I could block their telephone numbers. I could upgrade my security system. I could hire an entire firm of defense attorneys to draft cease and desist letters. But Richard and Susan had demonstrated a terrifying, profound willingness to completely ignore reality. They had managed to convince themselves that my private property was their rightful salvation. Desperate people do not respect emotional boundaries. They do not respect closed doors. They only respect absence. The only way to permanently protect myself from their extortion was to make the prize disappear completely. I needed to liquidate the property, and I needed to do it with surgical, brutal speed. A traditional real estate listing was entirely out of the question. Staging the living room, hosting open houses, and waiting through 30-day escrow periods would leave a massive public digital footprint. Tyler, with his frantic need to monitor my capitulation, would immediately see the listing pop up on his alerts. My father would undoubtedly show up at an open house and cause a humiliating public spectacle to scare away potential buyers. I required a ghost transaction. I needed a buyer who did not care about the paint colors in the guest bedroom or the quality of the local school districts. I needed a buyer who possessed unlimited liquid capital and could execute a closing before my mother even finalized her New Year's Eve catering menu. In the world of commercial underwriting, you build a very specific network of individuals who move large sums of money very quietly. 2 years ago, I had audited a massive portfolio for a high-end corporate relocation firm called Vanguard Executive Housing. They specialized in acquiring premium residential properties to house international executives on temporary corporate assignments. They did not rely on traditional bank financing. They bought exclusively in cash, and they bought incredibly fast. I pulled up my secure professional contact directory and dialed the direct line for their regional acquisitions director, a man named Julian. Julian answered his phone with the crisp, clipped efficiency of a man who evaluated his time in billable fractions. I did not waste a single second of it. I told him I possessed a premium, unencumbered 2-bedroom unit in a highly desirable suburban corridor. I assured him the title was perfectly clean, carrying 0 liens and 0 outstanding homeowner association violations. I offered to sell the property to Vanguard at a flat 8% discount below current market value. The discount was the bait. The conditions were the hook. I required a 48-hour all-cash closing and a legally binding leaseback clause that permitted me to remain in the unit as a temporary tenant until the 2nd of January. Julian did not ask why I was selling a prime asset at a discount. He did not inquire about the strange, highly specific timing of the leaseback agreement. Corporate buyers do not care about your personal family drama. They care entirely about profit margins and asset acquisition. He ran my address through his proprietary valuation software while I stayed on the line. I listened to the rapid, rhythmic clicking of his mechanical keyboard. Less than 2 minutes later, he agreed to the terms. He told me his legal team would draft the commercial purchase agreement within the hour and initiate the expedited title search immediately. While Julian mobilized a team of corporate lawyers to seamlessly transfer my net worth, my mother was busy mobilizing the neighborhood gossip mill. My phone chimed on my desk with a text message from Susan. She had sent a high-resolution photograph of 3 different fabric swatches spread out on a table. She wanted to know if the champagne ivory or the frosted pearl table linens would look better for the upcoming New Year's Eve bash at the country club. She followed up with a second text, adding a cheerful note saying Tyler had already begun pricing out local contractors to tear down the kitchen wall in my condo. The sheer cognitive dissonance of the situation was mesmerizing. Susan was agonizing over the aesthetic presentation of a victory party for a real estate acquisition that was currently evaporating into thin air. She was picking out expensive hors d'oeuvre and booking a string quartet to celebrate the impending financial ruin of her eldest daughter. She was arranging the centerpieces for a stage that would ultimately host her own destruction. I typed back a brief, pleasant message telling her the frosted pearl fabric looked incredibly elegant. I actively encouraged her to order the premium seafood catering package. Let her spend the money she did not have. Let her build the highest, most elaborate pedestal possible. I had learned that the taller the pedestal, the more devastating the eventual fall. I set my phone face down and returned my attention to the purchase agreement sitting in my email inbox. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in clinical corporate efficiency. Vanguard Executive Housing operated with a level of mechanical precision that made my underwriter's soul sing. Their preferred title company dispatched a mobile notary directly to my office conference room on Wednesday morning. The notary was a quiet, highly professional woman who asked for my state identification, arranged her stamping supplies, and handed me a thick stack of legal documents. I sat at the polished mahogany conference table and signed my name. I signed the seller disclosures. I signed the transfer tax declarations. I signed the temporary leaseback addendum. Finally, I signed the warranty deed. With a few smooth strokes of a blue ballpoint pen, the physical structure that had represented my independence ceased to be mine. It was a profoundly surreal moment. I had painted those interior walls. I had chosen those specific hardwood floors. But looking at the final signature, I felt no sentimental grief whatsoever. A home is only a home if it provides safety. The moment my family decided to turn it into a hunting ground, it became nothing more than a strategic asset waiting to be liquidated. I handed the completed paperwork back to the notary. She confirmed the documents were in perfect order, stamped her official seal, and securely uploaded the digital scans directly to the title company from her tablet. Within 3 hours, the transaction was officially recorded with the county clerk. At exactly 2:15 in the afternoon, a wire transfer for $386,400 cleared the holding account. I did not let those funds touch my standard domestic checking account. If my father somehow decided to make good on his threat and file his fabricated, frivolous lawsuit for unpaid childhood debts, I did not want a single dollar sitting in a vulnerable local jurisdiction where a desperate lawyer could attempt to freeze it. Prior to contacting Julian, I had established a secure, irrevocable offshore trust account. The massive wire transfer bypassed my daily banking entirely and landed directly into the trust. The money was now protected behind an impenetrable labyrinth of international financial privacy laws. It was completely legally untouchable by Richard Tyler or any predatory debt collector who might come looking for them. The condo was gone. It no longer belonged to Clara Hayes. It officially belonged to Apex Corporate Holdings, a subsidiary of Vanguard Executive Housing. It was now a faceless corporate asset, managed by an entity with a registered address in Delaware and a team of aggressive corporate litigators on permanent retainer. If Tyler attempted to bring a moving truck to that address on the 1st of January, he would not be dealing with his polite, accommodating sister. He would be dealing with a multi-million-dollar conglomerate that prosecuted trespassers and squatters as a matter of strict corporate policy. I walked back into my apartment that evening, stepping over the threshold of a space I no longer owned. The leaseback agreement was a brilliant piece of legal camouflage. It granted me the legal right to occupy the premises as a short-term tenant until the second day of the new year. This meant I did not have to immediately pack my belongings or hire a moving crew actions that would have certainly tipped off Tyler or my parents if they happened to drive by the building. I could continue to sleep in my own bed, cook in my own kitchen, and maintain the absolute illusion of normalcy. The walls looked the same. The evening light filtered through the blinds exactly as it always had, but the energy in the room had shifted completely. The heavy, oppressive anxiety that had been pressing down on my chest since Christmas dinner was entirely gone. I was standing inside a meticulously constructed trap, and I was holding the only key out. I walked out of the living room and began packing my most essential documents into a small, overnight bag. The transition was so perfectly seamless, it felt almost invisible. To the outside world, my life looked exactly the same. I was still answering underwriting emails. I was still drinking my black coffee. My car was still parked in the same assigned spot in the garage, but the fundamental geometry of my existence had been radically altered. I was no longer a target holding a valuable prize. I was a ghost, and my family was about to throw a massive party to celebrate capturing empty air. The most effective way to destroy an opponent is to give them exactly what they demand. Weaponized compliance is a subtle and terrifying art. It relies entirely on the arrogant presumption of your target. When a person believes they are inherently smarter, stronger, and more deserving than you, they will never question a sudden surrender. They will not look for a trap because their ego dictates that they simply won the battle. My family operated on a foundation of absolute entitlement. They believed my boundaries were made of paper. They believed my resistance was just a temporary tantrum that would inevitably collapse under the weight of their collective disapproval. I knew that if I continued to fight them, if I blocked their numbers or hired an attorney to send a cease and desist letter, they would remain highly alert. They would keep pushing, plotting, and looking for alternative ways to force my hand. I needed them to drop their guard completely. I needed them to walk into that country club on New Year's Eve, feeling incredibly relaxed, victorious, and completely insulated from any potential consequences. I needed them to sprint toward the edge of the cliff with their eyes closed. I sat at my kitchen island with a fresh cup of coffee and picked up my phone. The screen was still cluttered with the unread passive-aggressive messages my mother had sent over the past 48 hours. I opened our text thread. I did not type a long, emotional paragraph. I did not ask for a compromise. I typed 3 short, definitive sentences that I knew would act as pure gasoline on the fire of their delusion. I have thought about it. You are right. I will bring the paperwork to the party on New Year's Eve. I pressed send. I placed the phone flat on the marble countertop and watched it. The response was virtually instantaneous. The typing indicator bubbles appeared within 10 seconds. My mother did not ask what changed my mind. She did not ask if I was feeling okay. She simply accepted my total capitulation as her natural right. Her reply arrived wrapped in sickening, artificial warmth. I knew you would see reason, Clara. Family is everything. We are so proud of you. Wear that lovely navy dress, the one that photographs so well. She was already planning the pictures. She was envisioning the exact moment she would parade me in front of her friends, holding the physical proof of her dominance over her independent daughter. The sheer speed of her acceptance confirmed everything I had diagnosed about her condition. She was starving for a public victory to mask the private, terrifying reality of her impending foreclosure. The ripple effect of my text message moved through the family network with astonishing velocity. By that afternoon, the atmosphere shifted from hostile intimidation to celebratory greed. I did not have to speak to any of them to know exactly what was happening. I just had to observe the digital fallout. Tyler, a man who possessed no actual wealth but possessed an endless appetite for the performance of wealth, immediately took to his social media accounts. I created a sterile anonymous profile just to monitor his public feeds. It was a masterclass in unearned bravado. He posted a photograph of himself standing in front of a luxury car dealership wearing a tailored suit he had likely purchased on one of my parents' maxed-out credit cards. The caption read, "Big moves happening before the new year. Closing on a new piece of premium real estate. God is good to those who grind." He added several hashtags about generational wealth, real estate investing, and entrepreneurship. He was actively bragging to his fraternity brothers and his failed business partners about acquiring a property he had not paid a single dime for. He was constructing a towering monument to his own ego on a foundation of stolen equity. Several of his friends commented with fire emojis and congratulations. Tyler replied to one of them saying they should come by the new spot next week for drinks on the balcony. He was inviting guests to a condominium that was currently owned by a multi-million-dollar corporate relocation conglomerate. I read his comments and felt a profound clinical detachment. He was tying the noose around his own reputation tighter with every single keystroke. My mother was equally busy, though her theater operated in a different arena. Through a mutual acquaintance who attended her church, I learned that Susan had dramatically escalated the scale of the New Year's Eve bash. Now that she had my text message guaranteeing the delivery of the deed, she felt entirely secure in doubling down on the facade. She contacted the country club and upgraded the catering package. She added a premium seafood carving station and extended the open bar by 2 hours. She expanded the guest list, inviting the senior pastor, several prominent local business owners, and all the neighborhood gossips who had participated in her smear campaign against me. She wanted the largest possible audience to witness her triumph. She was spending money she absolutely did not have, likely advancing the remaining credit limit on her highly leveraged accounts, all based on the absolute certainty that she was about to extract $420,000 from my life. The tragic irony was that she was funding her own spectacular humiliation. While they spent their days broadcasting their imaginary wealth and planning their victory laps, I spent my nights executing a quiet, methodical erasure. The leaseback agreement I had signed with Vanguard Executive Housing permitted me to remain in the unit until the second day of January. However, I had zero intention of waiting until the last minute to pack. I needed the condominium to look perfectly normal from the outside, but I needed to completely extract my actual life from its walls. I became a ghost in my own home. I purchased dozens of heavy-duty moving boxes and a roll of industrial packing tape. Every night after the sun went down and the neighborhood grew quiet, I began the physical excavation of my space. I worked with the precision of a professional liquidator. I started with the items that held the most personal value: the custom artwork I had purchased from local galleries, the collection of rare books on my shelves, the framed photographs from my travels. I wrapped them in thick layers of protective paper and packed them away. I emptied my closets, folding my professional wardrobe into rigid wardrobe boxes, leaving only the navy dress my mother had requested, and a few basic essentials. I cleared out the kitchen cabinets, packing away the expensive cookware and the fine china I had slowly collected over 6 years. I was incredibly careful not to disturb the primary visual footprint of the apartment. If Tyler decided to drive by the building and look up at my third-floor windows, I needed him to see the silhouette of my sofa, the glow of my floor lamps, and the familiar shape of the dining table. I left the heavy furniture exactly where it was. I left the curtains hanging, but inside those rooms, the cabinets were entirely bare. The drawers were empty. The closets echoed. Stripping the soul out of my home was a bizarre, profoundly solitary experience. This was the place where I had built my independence, but as I taped the boxes shut and stacked them neatly in the center of the guest bedroom, out of sight from the windows, I did not feel any grief. The emotional connection to the property had been severed the moment my family decided it was a communal asset. The condo was no longer a home. It was just a movie set. It was a stage perfectly dressed to maintain an illusion until the curtain finally dropped. By the evening of December 30th, the transformation was complete. The relocation company had already wired the funds to my offshore trust. I had already secured a long-term executive rental in a different city, closer to my firm's regional headquarters. The moving company was scheduled to arrive at dawn on January 2nd to load the remaining heavy furniture and transport it across state lines. Everything was handled. Every variable was controlled. There was only one final task remaining. I stood in my hollowed-out living room. The only object resting on my dining table was a sleek black leather portfolio. It was a high-quality document carrier, the kind used by senior executives to transport highly sensitive corporate contracts. I opened my laptop and connected it to my wireless printer. It was time to assemble the payload. I opened the digital file containing the official recorded deed from the county clerk's office. I printed it on heavy, bright white legal paper. The printer hummed a low mechanical rhythm, churning out the exact architecture of their ruin. I took the freshly printed pages and laid them on the table. The grantor line clearly displayed my name. The grantee line clearly displayed Apex Corporate Holdings. The date of the sale, the transaction stamps the absolute finality of the cash transfer. It was a beautiful, devastating piece of literature. I slid the deed into the right side of the black leather portfolio. Next, I opened the public court dockets I had downloaded regarding Tyler's catastrophic business failure. I printed the official civil complaint filed by the private equity firm. 30 pages of brutal, uncompromising legal language detailing his breach of contract, his property damage, and the $300,000 judgment currently hanging over his head like an anvil. I highlighted the specific paragraphs where the plaintiff attorney successfully pierced his corporate veil, holding him personally liable for the debt. I wanted to ensure that when my parents looked at the paperwork, they would not be able to pretend they did not understand the gravity of his fraud. I placed the civil complaint into the left side of the portfolio. Finally, I pulled up the most destructive document of all, the notice of default regarding my parents' home equity line of credit. I printed the official county recording. The document explicitly listed Richard and Susan as the primary guarantors. It explicitly detailed the $250,000 they had leveraged against their own home to fund Tyler's empty shell companies. And it explicitly stated the 60-day timeline before the bank would initiate a public foreclosure auction. I took a red pen and drew a clean straight line under the foreclosure date. I wanted my father to look at that red line and know that his secret was completely exposed. I wanted him to understand that his desperate attempt to steal my home had not only failed, but had resulted in his own financial bankruptcy being laid bare for the world to see. I placed the notice of default directly on top of Tyler's civil complaint in the left pocket of the portfolio. I closed the black leather cover. The magnetic clasp snapped shut with a sharp, satisfying click. I ran my hand over the smooth leather surface. Inside this thin, elegant carrier rested the complete and total demolition of my family's false reality. There was no emotion inside that folder. There was no anger, no sorrow, no bitter childhood resentment. There was only cold, hard, heavily documented truth. I walked into my bathroom and looked at my reflection in the mirror. I did not look like a victim. I did not look like the quiet, compliant daughter who swallowed insults to keep the peace at the holiday table. I looked like a senior commercial underwriter who had just audited a massive fraudulent enterprise and was preparing to deliver the final rejection notice. My mother wanted me to wear the navy dress because she thought it photographed well. She wanted me to look presentable for my own execution. I decided I would wear exactly what she requested. I would play the part of the perfect, obedient sister right up until the very last second. I walked back to the living room, picked up the black portfolio, and set it next to my purse by the front door. The stage was set. The trap was fully loaded. The audience was currently putting on their evening gowns and ordering expensive drinks on a tab they could not afford. Tomorrow night, the music would stop. Tomorrow night, the champagne would run dry. I turned off the lights in the empty apartment and went to sleep feeling more peaceful and more powerful than I had ever felt in my entire life. The Oakmont Country Club at 10 o'clock on New Year's Eve is a masterclass in manufactured prestige. I pulled my car into the circular driveway and handed my keys to a valet wearing a tailored overcoat. The air was bitterly cold, but the grand double doors of the clubhouse spilled warm golden light out onto the frost-covered pavement. I stood on the aggregate steps for a moment, simply listening to the muffled, heavy bass line of a live jazz band vibrating through the thick glass. Tonight was the culmination of my family's grand illusion, and they had spared absolutely no financial expense to dress the stage. Walking into the main ballroom felt like stepping into a highly stylized financial crime scene. The room was draped in cascading silver and gold fabrics. Massive crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant glittering light over dozens of circular tables, each adorned with the frosted pearl linens my mother had agonized over via text message. Waiters in crisp black vests navigated the densely packed floor, carrying silver trays loaded with premium seafood Wagyu beef appetizers and flutes of incredibly expensive vintage champagne. I recognized the distinct factions of my parents' social ecosystem immediately. Near the front entrance, Susan's church friends congregated in tight circles, wearing heavily sequined dresses and dripping with polite suburban judgment. Along the mahogany bar, Richard's former corporate colleagues swapped golf stories and exaggerated their stock returns. And occupying a large corner booth near the dance floor was Tyler's entourage. A loud, disruptive collection of cryptocurrency enthusiasts and failed tech founders, all wearing expensive sneakers with tailored suits, shouting over the music, and drinking with the frantic energy of men who fundamentally misunderstood how actual wealth behaves. I stood near the coat check and let my professional instincts take the wheel. I could not help but mentally audit the room. The premium open bar alone for a guest list this size would easily clear $10,000 by midnight. The imported floral centerpieces, the live entertainment, the specialized catering package, all screamed of desperation. This was easily a $30,000 event. My father had financed this entire spectacle on credit cards that were already suffocating under maximum limits. He was pouring liquid cash he did not possess into a room full of people who would abandon him the second they learned his home was 60 days away from foreclosure. It was a breathtaking display of pathological denial. Richard and Susan were standing inside a burning building, using their last remaining dollars to buy expensive artwork to hang on the melting walls. They genuinely believed that if they simply projected enough success tonight, my signature on a piece of paper would magically extinguish the flames. They were attempting to manifest salvation through sheer, unadulterated vanity. I checked my reflection in the mirrored wall of the foyer. I was wearing the exact navy blue dress my mother had requested. It was understated, tailored perfectly, and completely devoid of flashy embellishments. I looked exactly like the compliant background character they expected me to be. Tucked securely under my left arm was the sleek black leather portfolio. It felt heavier than it actually was, weighted down by the sheer density of the truth resting inside its pockets. Before I could take 3 steps into the ballroom, Susan materialized from the crowd. She moved with the frantic, targeted velocity of a predator spotting its prey. She was wearing a floor-length emerald gown that looked brand new, and her smile was stretched so tightly across her face it looked physically painful. "Clara," she breathed, rushing forward and gripping my upper arms with fingers that felt like iron claws. "You made it. You look beautiful. Simply beautiful." She did not wait for me to thank her. She leaned in incredibly close. The scent of her expensive perfume was completely overpowered by the sharp metallic tang of her nervous sweat. Her smile remained fixed for the benefit of the church elders standing 10 feet away, but her voice dropped into a desperate tactical whisper. "Do you have the deed?" She did not ask how my drive was. She did not wish me a happy new year. She cut straight to the single transaction that mattered. I looked down at the black leather folder secured under my arm. I raised my right hand and gently tapped my index finger against the smooth, dark surface. "I brought the paperwork," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and exceptionally calm, just like I promised. The physical relief that washed over my mother's face was profound. Her shoulders visibly dropped. The tense, panicked energy radiating from her skin instantly dissolved or replaced by a radiant, soaring euphoria. She actually let out a small, breathless laugh. She believed the hunt was officially over. She believed the prey was safely locked in the cage. "Oh, sweetheart," she beamed by linking her arm tightly through mine. "I knew you would. I told your father you would do the right thing for us. Come with me. Everyone is dying to see you." What followed was a masterclass in social manipulation. Susan did not just walk me into the party. She paraded me. She dragged me through the dense crowd of guests like a conquered asset, a living trophy proving her ultimate dominance over her ungrateful child. We stopped at every major table. She introduced me to women I had never met, and reintroduced me to relatives I had intentionally avoided for years. "This is my eldest daughter," Clara Susan announced to a cluster of influential neighborhood gossips. "She is just so incredibly generous. You know, she is actually giving her beautiful condominium to Brittany and Tyler to help them start their new family. It is such a blessing to have a compliant, loving sister who truly understands what family means." The women cooed and clapped their hands, showering me with patronizing praise. They told me how sweet I was. They told me how proud my parents must be. They looked at me with the distinct, condescending approval reserved for a domesticated animal performing a neat trick. I did not flinch. I did not correct them. I smiled warmly at every single woman. I shook their hands. I nodded along with my mother's fabricated narrative. I played the part flawlessly because every piece of fake praise they heaped onto my shoulders was just another structural beam added to the stage of my mother's impending humiliation. She was actively building the audience that would witness her destruction. We moved toward the center of the room. The jazz band transitioned into a slow, elegant number. Waiters glided past us, swapping empty champagne flutes for full ones. Susan grabbed a fresh glass and pressed it into my free hand. "Drink up, darling," she insisted brightly. "Tonight is a celebration of our family legacy." I took a very small sip of the champagne. It was crisp, dry, and exceptionally expensive. I scanned the room and located the two men who engineered this disaster alongside her. Tyler was holding court in the corner booth. He had unbuttoned his suit jacket and loosened his tie. He was gesturing wildly with his hands, surrounded by his loud, equally arrogant friends. He was likely regaling them with fabricated tales of his real estate acumen. He looked like a man who had already spent the equity he believed I was handing him. He caught my eye across the crowded floor, raised his glass in a mock salute, and flashed a wide, predatory grin. He thought he had completely defeated me. Near the main stage, my father, Richard, was engaged in a deep conversation with the senior pastor of our church. Richard looked immaculate in a tailored tuxedo. He stood tall, projecting the ultimate image of suburban stability and financial wisdom. He was laughing deeply at a joke, exuding the relaxed confidence of a patriarch who had successfully navigated his family through a turbulent storm. No one in this room possessed the slightest clue that the man in the tuxedo was 60 days away from having his home auctioned off by the county sheriff. No one suspected that the grinning entrepreneur in the corner booth was currently facing a $300,000 commercial fraud lawsuit. They were all participating in a mass delusion perfectly choreographed by my mother, fueled by credit card debt, and anchored entirely on the black leather portfolio, resting quietly against my ribs. I slowly untangled my arm from my mother's grip. I told her I needed to use the restroom and refresh my lipstick before the midnight countdown began. She patted my cheek, her eyes shining with manic victory. "Do not take too long." "Clara," she chirped, "your father is going to make a very special announcement right before the clock strikes 12. We need you right up front." I promised her I would be right there. I walked away from the crowded dance floor, stepping into the quieter, dimly lit corridor, leading toward the club's administrative offices. I found a small, secluded alcove featuring a velvet bench and a large bay window overlooking the golf course. The manicured greens were covered in a pristine layer of winter frost, glowing pale silver under the moonlight. The frantic noise of the party was muted out here, reduced to a low, rhythmic thumping through the thick mahogany doors. I sat down on the velvet bench. I placed my champagne flute on a small side table. I laid the black leather portfolio flat across my lap. I ran my hand over the smooth, dark material. I did not feel any anxiety. My heart rate was completely normal. I did not feel the crushing weight of familial obligation that had dictated my entire adult life up until this week. I thought about the years I had spent shrinking myself to maintain the peace. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had quietly absorbed to cover their mistakes. I thought about the Christmas dinner where they had collectively decided my sanctuary was theirs for the taking. They had spent my entire life assuming I would fold under pressure. Tonight they had rented a ballroom and hired an orchestra simply to watch me break. I opened the portfolio. The right pocket contained the newly recorded warranty deed, clearly displaying the corporate holding company as the legal owner of the condominium. The left pocket held the devastating civil complaint against Tyler and the catastrophic notice of default on my parents' home equity line of credit. The documents were perfectly printed, sharply creased, and utterly lethal. I closed the portfolio and let the magnetic clasp snap shut. It was almost 11:45. The ballroom doors swung open briefly, releasing a loud burst of laughter and the sound of clinking glasses. The countdown was rapidly approaching. My father was likely already testing the microphone. My mother was gathering her friends near the stage. Tyler was probably preparing to walk up and accept the keys to a kingdom that no longer existed. I picked up my portfolio. I smoothed the skirt of my navy dress. I walked out of the quiet corridor and stepped back into the blinding, chaotic light of the grand ballroom. I navigated through the sea of expensive gowns and tailored suits, moving steadily toward the front of the room. I was exactly where they wanted me to be. I was perfectly compliant. I was holding the paperwork. The trap was fully set, and the orchestrators were eagerly stepping right into the center of it. The jazz band concluded their set with a lingering saxophone note that faded into the high ceiling of the ballroom. A waiter discreetly cleared empty glasses from the tables near the stage. The time was exactly 11:45. I knew the schedule because my mother had texted it to me 4 times that morning. The heavy velvet curtains at the back of the room were drawn shut, sealing us all inside this glittering bubble of manufactured prestige. Richard stepped up to the microphone stand, positioned in the center of the dance floor. He adjusted the lapels of his tuxedo with the practiced ease of a man who believed he owned the room. He tapped the metal grill of the microphone twice. The sharp, amplified thumps echoed over the low hum of conversation, instantly commanding the attention of the 100 guests scattered around the banquet tables. The chatter dissolved into a respectful hush. Faces turned toward the light. Susan stood a few feet away from him, her hands clasped beneath her chin, wearing an expression of absolute radiant devotion. "Thank you all for joining us tonight." My father began, his voice booming, rich, and resonant through the sound system. "It is a profound joy to ring in the new year, surrounded by our dearest friends, our church family, and our trusted colleagues." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the crowd. He was a master of the pregnant pause, a salesman who understood that an audience needed time to digest the performance. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, my fingers resting lightly on the smooth leather of the portfolio. I watched him work the room. I watched him sell a product that did not exist. This year has brought its share of challenges to everyone. Richard continued, his tone shifting into a register of profound paternal wisdom. But challenges are simply the fires that forge the strength of a family. And if there is one thing this family stands for, it is unity. It is the unwavering commitment to look out for our own blood. A gentle murmur of approval rippled through the audience. A woman at a nearby table nodded slowly, entirely captivated by the narrative. "As many of you know, my beautiful daughter Brittany is expecting her first child," my father said, gesturing warmly toward the corner booth where Tyler and Brittany were seated. Tyler stood up, buttoning his jacket, puffing his chest out as the room directed a polite round of applause toward them. Brittany smiled coyly and rested a hand on her stomach. "Starting a family is a beautiful journey," Richard said, his voice lowering to a staged, intimate volume, "but it requires a solid foundation." Tyler has been working incredibly hard, expanding his investment portfolio and navigating the unpredictable waters of entrepreneurship. And as any good businessman knows, sometimes you hit a temporary snag, a momentary delay in liquidity. But family does not let family struggle. We consolidate our strength. We build generational wealth by lifting each other up. He turned his body slightly, directing his focus to where I stood in the shadows. The spotlight seemed to stretch across the polished hardwood floor, pointing an invisible arrow directly at my chest. "That brings me to my eldest daughter, Clara," he announced. 100 pairs of eyes shifted toward me. I felt the collective weight of their gaze, heavy with expectation and manufactured admiration. "Clara has achieved remarkable success in her career," Richard proclaimed. "And tonight, she is demonstrating the true meaning of sacrifice. She has decided to generously downsize her own life to ensure her sister has the perfect place to raise our new grandchild. She is officially signing over the deed to her luxury condominium to Tyler and Brittany. She is keeping our wealth in the family where it belongs." The ballroom erupted into thunderous applause. People were cheering. I saw the senior pastor smiling broadly. I saw my mother wiping a single perfect tear from her cheek. Tyler was grinning so hard, his face looked distorted already, stepping away from his booth and walking toward the stage to claim his prize. "Clara, sweetheart," my father called out over the applause, extending his hand toward me. "Come on up here. Bring the paperwork. Let us make it official before the clock strikes midnight." The clapping continued, a rhythmic, suffocating wave of sound urging me forward. I did not hesitate. I stepped onto the dance floor. The heels of my shoes clicked softly against the wood, keeping perfect time with the beating of my heart. I moved with deliberate, unhurried grace. I did not look at the floor. I kept my chin perfectly level, maintaining eye contact with the man at the microphone. The walk felt incredibly long. A slow-motion procession through a gauntlet of smiling faces who had absolutely no idea they were witnessing an execution. I reached the edge of the stage. My father stepped down to meet me on the floor, holding his hand out to receive the documents. Tyler arrived a second later, standing right beside him. Tyler was practically vibrating with greed, his eyes locked onto the black leather folder in my hands. "Thank you, Clara," my father whispered, leaning in close so the microphone would not pick up his voice. His tone was tight, urgent, and laced with absolute relief. "Just hand it to Tyler and smile for the camera." A photographer hired by my mother stepped out of the crowd, raising a large camera with a heavy flash attachment. I did not hand the folder to my father. I bypassed his outstretched hand entirely. I stepped directly in front of Tyler. I opened the magnetic clasp of the portfolio. The sound was barely audible, a tiny snap swallowed by the lingering applause. The room began to quiet down, sensing that the transaction was taking place. The audience waited for the ceremonial exchange of the deed. I reached into the right pocket of the portfolio. I pulled out a thick stack of paper. It was not just a single sheet. It was a heavy, dense collection of legal filings. Tyler reached out and grabbed the stack eagerly, a triumphant smirk plastered across his face. He expected a simple quitclaim form, something he could immediately wave in the air for the photographer. I released the paper into his hands. I stepped back half a pace and watched his eyes drop to the top page. The human face is a fascinating canvas when the brain receives a catastrophic shock. The cognitive dissonance requires several seconds to process reality. Tyler looked at the bold black letters at the top of the civil complaint. He saw the name of the private equity firm suing him. He saw the phrase, breach of commercial lease. He saw the bolded damage demand of $300,000. His smirk did not slowly fade. It collapsed. The muscles in his jaw went completely slack. The arrogant gleam in his eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by the blank, vacant stare of a man plummeting from a very great height. The color drained from his cheeks so rapidly, he looked physically ill. His hands began to tremble, the thick stack of court records shaking visibly in his grip. "What is this?" He choked out his voice, a hoarse, ragged wheeze that barely reached my ears. My father saw Tyler freeze. Richard looked down at the papers in Tyler's shaking hands. He recognized the formatting of a court docket immediately. Confusion warped my father's features. He looked at me, his brow heavily furrowed. "Clara, what did you give him?" Richard demanded in a harsh whisper. "Where is the deed?" I did not answer him in a whisper. I did not keep the conversation private. They wanted this transaction to happen in front of 100 people. They had demanded an audience. I reached out and took the microphone directly from my father's hand. He did not resist. He was too stunned by Tyler's physical reaction to process what I was doing. I stepped to the center of the floor. I held the cold metal of the microphone near my mouth. The ballroom was completely, profoundly silent. The lingering chatter had died. The clinking of glasses had ceased. The air felt thick, charged with the sudden sharp realization that the script had gone terribly wrong. "Dad just asked me to hand over the deed to my condo," I said into the microphone. My voice echoed through the massive room. It was not shaking. It was not angry. It was the clear, commanding voice of a senior commercial underwriter delivering a final financial assessment. It cut through the silence like a scalpel. But I cannot do that. I continued letting my gaze sweep across the faces of the church elders, the corporate colleagues, and the neighborhood gossips. Because as of yesterday afternoon, the condo no longer belongs to me. It belongs to Apex Corporate Holdings. I sold it for cash. The silence in the room fractured. A collective audible gasp swept through the crowd. I heard a woman in the front row murmur a sharp exclamation of shock. My mother, standing 10 feet away, let out a strangled, high-pitched noise, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Her eyes widened into massive, terrified circles. My father lunged forward, his face turning a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. He reached for the microphone, his polished facade completely disintegrating. "Clara, shut your mouth, right now," he hissed, his voice carrying without the aid of amplification. I took a swift step backward, easily evading his grasp, keeping the microphone firmly in my hand. I turned my body slightly so I was addressing the entire room while looking directly at my parents. The performance was over. The audit was complete. It was time to read the final ledger. I could not bring the deed I projected clearly over the rising murmur of the crowd. But I did bring paperwork. I brought the public court records that Tyler is holding right now. I pointed directly at my brother-in-law, who was still paralyzed, staring at the pages as if they were covered in poison. Those records show that Tyler is not suffering a temporary liquidity snag, I announced, ensuring every single syllable hit the back wall of the ballroom. He is actively being sued for $300,000 in commercial fraud by a private equity firm. He is bankrupt, and he is facing total financial ruin. The crowd erupted into shocked whispers. Tyler dropped the papers. They scattered across the polished hardwood floor, the harsh black text exposed for anyone in the front row to read. Brittany let out a loud, wailing sob from the corner booth. But that is not the worst part. I continued, my voice slicing effortlessly through the growing chaos. I reached into my portfolio one final time and pulled out the crisp white document bearing the county recorder stamp. I held it up high, presenting it to the audience like a piece of irrefutable evidence in a courtroom. I also brought the default notices from the county clerk, I declared. These notices prove that my parents, Richard and Susan, secretly leveraged their own home. They took out a massive home equity line of credit to bail Tyler out of his fraudulent business deals, and Tyler stopped making the payments. I lowered the paper and looked directly into my father's eyes. The man who had tried to extort me for childhood medical bills was now trembling, his chest heaving completely exposed in front of the very people he had tried to impress. My parents are currently in default, I told the silent, horrified room. They are losing their house to foreclosure in exactly 60 days. My mother collapsed into a nearby chair, burying her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. The illusion she had spent decades cultivating was instantly, permanently eradicated. There was no recovering from this. The carefully built architecture of their social standing had been demolished in less than 2 minutes. I lowered the microphone. The sheer volume of the silence that followed my final statement was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. The entire ballroom was trapped in a state of absolute paralysis, witnessing the catastrophic destruction of a family's false reality. I looked at my mother weeping in her chair. I looked at my father stripped of his pride and his assets. I looked at Tyler exposed as a fraud to his friends and his in-laws. They did not want my condo for Brittany, I said, my voice carrying clearly even without the microphone. They never cared about a nursery. They wanted to steal my equity to pay Tyler's debts. And they thought if they put me on a stage, I would be too scared to tell the truth. The orchestra members behind me on the stage sat frozen with their instruments resting in their laps. A waiter standing near the buffet tables had completely stopped pouring water, the pitcher hovering motionless over a glass. The entire country club had been reduced to a frozen tableau of shock and horror. I walked over to where the court documents lay scattered across the dance floor. I did not pick them up. I let them remain exactly where they had fallen, a public display of the lies they had tried to bury. I gently placed the microphone down on a small cocktail table. It made a soft, hollow thud against the wood. My father stood rooted to the spot. His hands hung limply at his sides. The furious, commanding patriarch who had demanded my obedience just 10 minutes ago had entirely vanished. In his place stood an old, desperate man who had gambled his entire life on a bluff and lost everything. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to construct a defense, but there were no words left to spin. The documents on the floor spoke louder than he ever could. My mother raised her head from her hands. Her carefully applied makeup was ruined, streaming down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for a reprieve that she had never once offered me. She wanted me to fix it. She wanted me to pull out my checkbook and make the nightmare disappear, just as I had done so many times before. But the bank was officially closed. The accounts were settled. The underwriter had issued the final denial. I closed the empty black leather portfolio and tucked it neatly beneath my arm. I turned my back on my parents, on my sister, and on the man who had tried to steal my sanctuary. I did not wait for the clock to strike midnight. I did not wait for the ball to drop. My new year had already begun. The large digital clock projected onto the wall above the bandstand flickered to life. It was a pre-programmed sequence set by the event coordinator to initiate exactly 3 minutes before midnight. Large, luminous white numbers began to count down the final seconds of the year. The timing was a masterpiece of accidental cinematic perfection. I stood in the center of the dance floor, bathed in the glow of the ticking numbers, watching the shockwave of my announcement reverberate through the ballroom. The silence that had initially gripped the room began to fracture, replaced by a rising, chaotic symphony of frantic whispers. 100 prominent community members were suddenly analyzing every boast my mother had made over the past decade. The illusion of the wealthy, stable family was unraveling in real time, exposed beneath the glittering chandeliers. Richard stepped forward. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He reached out with a trembling hand, attempting to grab the microphone I had placed on the cocktail table. He wanted to issue a denial. He needed to spin a counter-narrative to salvage his reputation. But there is no counter-narrative to public court dockets scattered across a hardwood floor. I did not fight him for the metal cylinder. I simply pulled my hand back and let the microphone roll off the edge of the small table. It hit the floor with a sharp electronic squeal of feedback that made several people in the front row cover their ears. That piercing noise was the exact sound of his authority dying. To my left, Tyler finally broke out of his paralysis. The sheer humiliation of being exposed as a fraud in front of his peers overrode whatever small amount of logic he possessed. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson, and he lunged toward me, his hands balled into tight fists. He took 2 aggressive steps, expecting the wall of his cryptocurrency friends and business partners to follow him and back up his intimidation. But they did not move forward. I watched as his entourage, the men who had been drinking expensive champagne on his non-existent tab all night, actively took a collective step backward. In the financial sector, when a corporate entity is publicly revealed to be insolvent and facing severe litigation, investors immediately divest. Human beings operate on the exact same principle. Tyler's friends looked at the legal documents resting on the floor and instantly recognized a catastrophic liability. They physically distanced themselves, leaving Tyler stranded alone on the dance floor. He stopped in his tracks, looking over his shoulder at the men who were suddenly fascinated by their own shoes. He was entirely isolated, stripped of his manufactured power, standing with empty pockets in a room full of people who now knew exactly how little he was worth. I shifted my gaze to my mother. Susan had not moved from the chair she collapsed into. She was surrounded by her inner circle of church friends and neighborhood socialites, but none of them were comforting her. The women who had been praising her generosity just 20 minutes ago were now standing with their arms tightly crossed, whispering furiously among themselves. They were looking at her with a chilling mixture of horror and profound distaste. In their affluent suburban ecosystem, financial struggle was a private shame, but attempting to steal from your own child to cover up a fraud was an unforgivable social crime. Susan looked up at the women she had spent 30 years trying to impress. She reached a hand out toward the pastor's wife. The woman literally took a step back, pulling her evening gown away, as if my mother were suddenly contagious. Susan's hands dropped to her lap. She shrank into the chair, visibly aging a decade in the span of 60 seconds. Her social currency, the only asset she truly valued, had just evaporated into absolute nothingness. The digital clock on the wall clicked down to the final 60 seconds. The bandleader, clearly terrified and completely unsure of how to navigate the unfolding domestic destruction, desperately tried to fulfill his contractual obligations. He raised his baton, and the orchestra began a slow, hesitant rendition of a traditional holiday tune. It was a surreal, disjointed soundtrack to the wreckage. I turned my back on the stage. I did not say goodbye. I did not issue a final, triumphant parting remark. I simply began to walk toward the heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom. The crowd parted for me. It was not a polite shifting of bodies. It was a rapid, deliberate clearing of a path. People stepped back, pulling their chairs in, ensuring they did not block my exit. I walked through the center of the country club with my head held high, my posture perfectly aligned, clutching my empty black leather portfolio. As I reached the grand foyer, the crowd behind me finally began the mandatory chant, their voices subdued and completely devoid of celebratory joy. 10, 9, 8. I handed my valet ticket to the attendant standing near the coat check. He looked at me with wide eyes, having clearly heard the amplified broadcast of my speech through the open hallway. He sprinted out the door to retrieve my vehicle. 7, 6, 5. I stepped out onto the frost-covered aggregate steps. The freezing winter air hit my face sharp and incredibly clean. I took a deep, unrestricted breath, filling my lungs with an atmosphere entirely free of my family's suffocating expectations. 4, 3, 2. The valet pulled my car up to the curb. I tipped him a crisp $50 bill, opened the driver's side door, and slid into the leather seat. 1. A muted, unenthusiastic cheer echoed from the ballroom behind me, followed immediately by the sound of popping corks that felt more like gunshots. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the country club. I did not look in the rearview mirror. There was absolutely nothing left behind me worth checking on. The drive back to the city center took 25 minutes. I navigated the empty streets, watching the glow of streetlights wash over my dashboard. I parked in the subterranean garage for the very last time. I rode the elevator up to the 3rd floor and approached the door secured by the heavy commercial keypad I had installed just days ago. I punched in my code. The deadbolt engaged with a satisfying mechanical clank. I stepped into the completely hollowed-out apartment. The moving company had cleared the heavy furniture that morning. The only item remaining in the vast, echoing living space was a single rolling suitcase resting near the kitchen island. Standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows was a woman wearing a tailored charcoal suit. She was the regional agent for Vanguard Executive Housing, the corporate conglomerate that now owned my former sanctuary. "Good evening, Clara," she said, her voice carrying the brisk, efficient tone of a late-night corporate transaction. "Happy New Year." "Happy New Year to you as well," I replied. I reached into my purse and pulled out the physical keys to the building's lobby and the programming instructions for the new smart lock. I handed them over to her. She placed them into a branded envelope and handed me a final property release form. I signed my name one last time. "The space is all yours," I told her. "The utilities have been formally transferred. The title is clear. She thanked me for the seamless transaction. I grabbed the handle of my rolling suitcase. I walked out of the apartment, listened to the door click shut, and took the elevator down to my car. I loaded my luggage into the trunk, merged onto the interstate highway, and drove toward my temporary executive rental. I felt lighter than I had ever felt in my adult life. The heavy, crushing ledger of familial debt had been perfectly and permanently zeroed out. 3 months later, the morning sun reflects brightly off the glass facade of the commercial high-rise where I now work. I am sitting in a spacious corner office on the 22nd floor, overlooking a completely different skyline in a completely new city. My promotion to senior portfolio director came with a substantial salary increase, a generous relocation package, and an unlisted corporate phone number. I am currently evaluating a $90 million commercial development loan, sifting through the applicant's risk profile with the exact same clinical precision I used to dismantle my own family. The transition was remarkably clean. When you do not leave a forwarding address and you change your personal contact information, people who rely on easy access simply give up. But the consequences of the New Year's Eve exposure played out exactly according to the mathematical certainty of their financial negligence. I learned the final details through a former colleague who still lives in my old suburban hometown. Tyler did not manage a miraculous corporate turnaround. The private equity firm pursued their breach of contract lawsuit with absolute ruthlessness. They secured a summary judgment against him, officially finalizing his $300,000 liability. Without the equity from my condo to shield him, he was forced to declare personal bankruptcy. The stress of his financial ruin shattered whatever fragile illusion held his marriage together. Brittany moved back into my parents' house, bringing the new baby into an environment of profound stress and resentment. But my parents' house did not belong to them for very much longer. Richard and Susan were completely incapable of curing the default on their massive home equity line of credit. The regional bank executed the foreclosure proceedings precisely on schedule. The 4-bedroom suburban house where I grew up, the property my mother treated as the ultimate symbol of her social superiority, was auctioned off on the courthouse steps on a rainy Tuesday morning. They lost every ounce of equity they had built over 30 years. They were forced to pack their belongings into rented trucks and move into a cramped, outdated 2-bedroom apartment on the industrial side of town. The church community they had catered to for decades quietly shunned them, embarrassed by the public scandal and entirely unwilling to associate with financial failure. I turn away from the city skyline and focus my attention back to the dual monitors on my desk. I open my personal email account to check a notification from my investment broker. Sitting in the spam folder flagged automatically by my rigorous security filters is a new message. The sender name is Susan. I hover my cursor over the subject line. It simply reads, "Please, Clara, we are desperate." I do not open the email. I do not read the frantic, emotionally manipulative paragraphs I know are waiting inside. I do not need to know the specific details of their latest emergency or listen to my mother try to weaponize her tears through a keyboard. I already know the plot, and I am permanently finished funding the production. In the commercial lending industry, when an applicant demonstrates a chronic history of fraud entitlement and defaulting on their obligations, you do not renegotiate the terms. You do not extend another line of credit. You simply close the file and move on to a viable investment. I press the delete button. The message vanishes from the server, erased as completely as their influence over my life. I pick up my ceramic mug, take a slow, satisfying sip of my black coffee, and turn my attention back to the lucrative contract waiting on my screen. The office is quiet, the numbers are perfectly balanced, and the peace of absolute, unshakable justice hums steadily through the room.